All right, so this is the Hierarchy of Focal Points lecture, and if you have not had a chance to listen to, or it's been a while since you've listened to the um, Value Basics lecture, where I'm swapping out all the shapes and just talking about the principles of value, I recommend maybe watching that first, or just reviewing it, just to get so that the principles are and the vocab words are fresh in your mind, so that when you're watching this video, I think it will be more helpful for you. So and that being said, so in this class so far, before we were prematurely separated, we spent a lot of time talking about eye movement via gesture, the energy of an object's movement one way or the other, its visual weight, and its central axis. We also talked a lot about eye movement when just talking about those, putting objects together so that there is a continuity of eye movement amongst all of them, controlling the viewer's eye so that there's not a stagnation when the viewer looks at your object, your still life drawing. And I spent quite a bit of time playing around with this still life, thinking about those things, looking at the big shapes and how things move around. And that being said, just before I move on any further, I'll be using my little laser pointer here to point out a lot of stuff. And I will be using this still life to do some of the upcoming demo videos that you'll be watching, just on basic starts of multiple objects, doing an envelope start with multiple objects is something that we haven't done yet. Hopefully you've been practicing your sphere drawing and your bottle drawing from the other videos and enjoying that process with the charcoal, the pushing and pulling. When I'm talking about the values that we're seeing in this still life in front of us, when I'm doing some of the demoing, the values are quite a bit different in real life. In order for a lot of these lights not to be super blown out and information lost, I had to pull it down into the dark quite a bit. I will try to adjust it in Photoshop and post that online for you guys as well, so that the photo that I share with you of this is closer to what is up there. But it might be a little bit different, but in general, since value is relative, it'll be darker, but overall the relationships will remain the same. It'll just be overall, everything will be a little bit darker in the photo. So if something seems a little bit off in that area, that's most likely what's happening. So I just wanted to point that out. But back to the eye movement, when I set this still life up, I was looking at some of the basic energy and the movement of things, trying to get some gestural aspects going, like with this boot curving into the top of the picture here, the way that the handle arc, if continued it from this point, kind of connects down into the bottoms of both of these, as well as those shadow shapes. The way that the energy or the movement of this pushing back brings us up into the zipper, and then back down around, down into the boot. There's a nice connection between here and here. And even the cloth, how it's coming down this way, but doesn't go all the way off. So when I do the drawing, I would like to try to capture the value separation here, so that it diagonally brings our eye back down to the corner, which brings us back here to the vase, and then brings us back into the boot. So those are some of the things that I was thinking about, and also having one object facing this way, pointed that direction, one pointed kind of more out towards the viewer, and then another one pointed kind of out off into the left. So they're all kind of pointing in different directions in space, so it kind of makes it interesting, keeps the eye moving. So when you're setting up your still life, it is really still important. So even though we're talking about value, it's important to make sure that the composition's solid and interesting, just based on those shapes and rhythms and gestural energy of the objects relating to one another, so that it's a dynamic aspect of visual interest happening. And I guess that, and then that brings us to hierarchy of focal points, which is going to be what we're talking about today. We're going to talk first a little bit more theoretically about it, and then we're going to talk about how to actually apply it, what is actually happening on the paper when you're doing it, and how you're using the principles of value to make this work, the hierarchy work. And in general, the hierarchy of focal points is doing the exact same thing that we've been practicing so far. It's about eye movement. So it's essentially utilizing value to keep the viewer's eye moving, and to, among other things, which we'll talk about. There's some other great aspects of thinking about the hierarchy of focal points, but it's basically an added layer on top of the compositional elements and energy and movement and gestural elements. It's layered on top of and plays with, supports how the eye moves through a piece. So, the basic principle that it kind of relies on is, or definitely relies on, is the principle that the human eye is attracted to high contrast. So your darkest dark and your lightest light will be the first thing that the eye is drawn towards, and then it kind of will move from that higher contrast object or area to the next high contrast area. It's a little bit less contrasted, and then to the third area or object that is has a certain level of contrast, and then whatever to the fourth. So you can have multiple focal points, but they will be ranked as as visually important based on their contrast, their light and dark aspects. So when we're looking at this still life here, our first focal point would be here, our second would be here, third would be here, and then fourth is going to be our boot when we're just kind of looking at the objects. Now, a focal point can be an area. Some areas are less focal point, so less of a focal point. So when I'm talking about this being the second focal point, it's more this region, the dark behind it, the dark of the whole, the white of the top part of the vase, but not in here. This in here is not part of the focal point. It's this part here. This being the first focal point, that cupcake, it's almost all of it's the focal point, but we're first drawn to that frosting with that dark black background behind it. So that's the basic rundown of the hierarchy of focal points here in this still life. So let's talk about how to determine what your hierarchy of focal points is, and what most likely is going to affect that. So first I want to start off by saying that you can't really choose what's going to be the hierarchy of focal points. It really is determined by these factors that we're going to discuss here, that I'm going to list and point out. The only time you actually have the opportunity to, if you're doing what we're doing, which is going for realism, is to work with what's in front of you and break it down on these principles. However, when you are setting up your still life, that's the only time you really have an opportunity to have control of what you want to be the focal point. So, in this setup, if I wanted this to be the focal point, then I would probably want to put it closer to the light source and do a bunch of different variety of things that would make it pop out more. If I wanted the boot more, maybe I do a white background, which I'm going to show you here in a little bit, so that there was higher contrast between the boot and its environment, so it became a focal point. Right now it's the last focal point because it's so dark. So you really don't have a choice. I only bring that up because sometimes people, when I'm teaching this class in person, one misunderstanding that happens is someone likes an object better than another one. They're more interested in it, but its values don't really make it the focal point. It's based on the factors we're going to discuss. So spend some time definitely thinking about and setting up your still life so that these things are allowing you to draw the thing that you want to draw to make as the focal point, and then be truthful to what you're seeing in front of you based on these principles that we're talking about. And that being said, I've thrown out the word realism and accuracy a few times. We've talked about in this class, our pursuit of realism and why we're doing this. And I personally, with my own work at this stage, I don't pursue it, but I still practice these things quite a bit, and I value the principles involved in tackling realism and practicing it, because one, we've talked about, sharpens your eye, but two, you might be asking yourself when you're doing a drawing, like, oh, what does it matter if this isn't in the bottom of that picture, is not in the right spot, or this is not in the right spot up here, or the angle of the boots slightly different, or a little bit thinner or wider. And the thing that I remind myself of is there's a lot of very delicate connections and rhythms that roll through here that make this work, and if I'm not faithful to what I'm seeing as best as I can with these things in mind, some of the more subtle rhythms that are happening in this still life, so for instance, the way that this picture tips down at just the right angle, that it catches right along the edge of that form shadow, right where the terminator exists. The way that, if you come off of this handle here, how the arc of that handle, if we were to continue it, rides along the patterning of the picture, which would then continue and lead us right into, back into our main focal point. The way that this shadow here is connecting nicely up into this form shadow here. It almost is like one long shadow that's beautiful. So if this was shifted over to here and went up into the white, or if this didn't tip down at the right angle, that connection would be lost there. If the zipper didn't come at just the right angle so that we would catch the highlight and ride down that rhythm there and up into the cupcake, or even if we were to continue that arc, how it kind of nicely rolls up and catches the bottom edge of the picture, or even how that highlight here rides along and catches nicely onto the bottom of our main focal point. So there's a lot of these little rhythms, even like right here where we have the shadow, how if we were to continue it, how it kind of connects into this shadow edge here, which then rides back into the cupcake. So there's all these nice little rhythms that roll through here that if we weren't accurate to it, we would miss it. And it sharpens our eye, but it also it sharpens our eye to see these beautiful connections. I didn't see a lot of those subtleties when I first set this still life up. I was looking at more of the bigger shapes, but then I spent quite a bit of time just kind of looking at it and seeing what was there. And oftentimes, even if you don't set something up, there is a lot of this happening all around us visually in our day-to-day life, just by the way life works, the visual world works. So I'm not sure why, but I think it's everywhere, and it's good to practice looking for it. And so spend some time. Don't rush the setup, and take some time looking at the still life and finding those beautiful connections and being as faithful as you can to it. I think thinking about it that way makes it feel less about how realistic can I be, the ego aspects of it, which I think sometimes feel pretty pointless. But if it's about something bigger, it makes the practice of it feel better, at least for me. So that's my little my little random speech in the middle of this. So so where were we? So we were talking about the list. So your basic things that determine your focal points, the things to think about, the questions to ask yourself if it's hard to tell or you're not certain. You're going to want to look at your still life and just look at the basic local value of each object. That'll make a big difference. So it also depends on the background. So in this case, I have a dark background. If I had a light background, which I'll show you, it'll be different. But in this case, it's a dark background. So anything that's dark will most likely not be a focal point. Anything that's white or light will be a focal point. And if we look at these light objects, you know, the white of the vase is the lightest local value. That white's brighter and whiter than the frosting. The frosting is brighter and whiter though than the white pitcher. That's kind of an off yellow. That's got a little bit of a yellow hue to it, and this is a little bit of a cooler white and a little brighter. So that right there tells me that most likely it's going to be one of these three, and then based on that scaling of first, second, third, this one most likely would be a focal point, right? Now, the reason that this is the first focal point is for a couple reasons. One, for the most part, you see that the value around the white, even that back gray area back there, is lighter than the dark that's back behind this frosting, this white here. So just because of that being that dark based on value relativity makes this feel brighter, makes it pop stronger than this one here. The black hole there definitely plays a heavy, has a heavy weight to it that draws the eye pretty quickly. So when I look at this, my eye goes here and it quickly is pulled over to here, and then a little slower pulled over to here, and then slower to the boot. It's good to practice this, so if you aren't seeing that or feeling that eye movement happening, a good exercise to do is to get, I love doing it, most of the great artists in my art book collection, I think I've mentioned I'm an art book junkie, and most of the artists that I have books of are utilize this tool a lot, and it's fun to kind of see how they do it and to try to see how it holds together when they do it. So even just flipping through photography, if you like photography, or paintings and drawings, and thinking about the hierarchy of focal points while you're looking at it helps train your eye, which is one, fun to do, but two, it's really helpful so that when you're looking at your own work, you can see it faster. And so yep, first, second, third. So it's good to think about the local value, helps a ton. And then the next thing that really is helpful to think about is what's closest to the viewer, because that tends to also have a higher contrast. And the viewer or yourself or the picture plane, essentially the front edge of the objects, and in that case it would be the vase and the cupcake and the boot, but the boot's not in play because of its darker value, so it's again these two. So right now this has 2 points to being the highest, and this has 1.5 because it's a little bit further back than this one from the picture plane. So why is this one the second? And the reason that is because, and there's a handout for this that is accompanied with it, but there's other aspects that come into play when we're talking about visual weight, and one of them is an object of two objects of a similar value and roughly similar size will be of the same weight, but if one of those objects is more complex, it will have more visual weight than the more simple object. And so in this case, this is a fairly simple object, especially where the light and contrast is happening, except for that little rim. It's got a little bit of highlight and got some nice curves to it. It's very simple compared to the complexity of this. And when we're talking about the complexity, we're talking about the light dark patterning. So there's a lot of visual noise because of that high contrast, but spotted with sharp edge high contrast. So that's why our eye is pulling to that first. So one, it's because of the strong black and the white behind, or the black behind that white frosting, and two, because of the complexity of it, is making our eye go there first. So that comes into play quite a bit. So check out that handout, it's helpful. That one in particular, the complexity aspect, or the textural aspect, tends to happen more often than some of the other ones on that list, but check it out. and when you're setting up your still life, and see if any of the other basic visual weight principles affect your still life setup. And the other one that I like to recommend, well, I guess would be the proximity to the light source. So it kind of is more of an obvious one, but the closer it is, the object is to the light source, the brighter the light will be, and then therefore darker the shadow will be. So you know, in this case, if this picture, if we turned a light on the right side, which I'm going to do later, and this was getting hit with a stronger light, this would start to be less third place, maybe more second place, just based on its proximity to the light source. So, and even the boot, if there was a white background back here and this was getting hit, or even that would increase, well, the shadow would increase if we moved that light closer to the boot, would increase that shadow and push the light. Even I guess with the dark background, that would still be the same case. So proximity to the light source makes a difference. And then, and I'm going to play with the lights. I'm going to play with the background some and move some of the objects a little bit too, just to kind of show you how the focal point of things changes here. But we'll kind of keep with the theoretical for now. And let's see, the next one will be squinting. So squinting makes a huge help when you're trying to sort out your focal points. And so the best thing that you can do is to kind of squint lightly at first, and then keep squinting harder and harder and harder until you can barely see through your eyelashes, until they're almost like they keep closing and slightly popping back open. And the basic rule of thumb is whatever vanishes first is most likely not going to be your main focal point. Whatever remains longest, that you're able to see most clearly, will most likely be the focal point. And again, this guy started to hang in there pretty good. This one here still is pretty strong. So you know, it's kind of a tie between these two. And in that case, you know, I still think this is winning. But when I do my drawing, I sort out, that's a devil in the details. I sort that out as I go. This might end up getting pushed a little bit further, just so that spatially this comes out farther than this, but we'll see how it goes. But that's the main things that are helpful to determine your hierarchy of focal points if it's not really obvious right when you look at it. So let's do just a little bit of experimenting here. And then we can move more to the application aspect. So, you know, this would be, I'm tipping it down a little bit to put a little bit more emphasis. So now we have more of a stronger value hitting that vase. So you can see how that really pushed back the that cupcake. Still pulls forward quite a bit, but not like it did before. Now my eye really goes to that little vase and really emphasizes the spatial. In this kind of scenario, that distance from here to here feels a lot greater than it had before, and then it really emphasizes the weight of that picture. So before, when the light was up a little bit higher, this was more of a focal point than down below, but because I had tipped it down, then this contrast got quite a bit greater. That shadow got blacker and this got lighter, so it kind of gives it a heavier feel, and this became a little bit more dominant even though it's getting hit with less light, which is kind of interesting to see. And I think because this got darker, that disfrosting you know, starts to feel even brighter, even though it's getting hit with less light too. So that value relativity is pretty important and can play some cool games. But that, I don't know, for me, this gets a little bit too intense, and it makes it not as dynamic. The movement that happens in here is not as dynamic. I like that previously how it was set up. The the visual weight in general, you know, when I do the drawing is going to be over here, and we just have this picture that keeps pulling us back and jump starting us back into the rhythm again. So it's almost like a counterweight to the stronger rhythms, the main strong rhythms that are happening in here. And it's nice that it's in the bottom left corner and it's an entrance point. So I think it's a little bit stronger this way, but I thought that might be a little interesting for you all to see. And you know, even if we were to then, you know, tip it up a little higher and make that bass little bass, our second focal point, a little less intense, and make this picture even stronger. So now that really pulls the weight, and there's almost you almost look past the frosting. I mean, you kind of look at it, but then you go right to this picture, and you kind of bounce back and forth between these two. So now the picture is more important, almost because of its proximity to the main focal point, which this is still the main focal point, but you quickly go from here to here, even though there is a pretty great contrast here. But when we squint, that contrast is fairly minimal. I mean, it feels bright because the darks got darker, but when we squint, do you see how that picture still is so big? So that's one of the other visual weight things, is that because this is so large, and it's fairly textural and fairly complex, and this is small and simple, this starts to have more of a dominance because of that as well. And with that up higher, the gestural aspect of the whole boot becomes more important visually in it. So it's kind of interesting to see now we have these two bigger objects kind of anchoring in the center, which I don't think I like as much. When it was down lower, the center line of the boot was more powerful, and it was a kind of exaggerated the gestural aspect of it, as opposed to its width and structural aspect. So you know, it is helpful to spend time looking at it. Let's see. So now let's turn this way and see how that feels. And that's, you know, I think it's a little bit more stagnant, because this back end here is not as interesting. It's kind of flat, and sorry, pull it that way a little bit. It's just not as interesting. The basic diagonal of it's kind of nice, but it kind of goes up now as opposed to down into these movements here. There's not a lot up there. I mean, I guess it kind of points back at the cupcake, and then maybe into that handle, which is nice, but that handle is so secondary. It's kind of just makes more of like just a straight line back and forth, as opposed to engaging this boot a little bit, and doesn't really affect the value, though. That still is fairly strong hitting it, but having that little black hole really had some nice visual heavy interest to it there. So you can just see by just doing those couple little shifts can really change the dynamic. Even that shadow now, how it's kind of just going off, not as interesting as it was before when it was arcing and connecting into these here with the shadows. So go ahead and turn this back. Yeah, that's fine. Go a little bit. Yeah. Pull this up a little bit. Right, so and you can, you know, pivot the light back and forth. Definitely play around with it. I'm going to post a bunch of references for you to choose from, as well as if you're not in a position to set up your own still lifes. I recommend that you do, because it's a really great learning experience, as you all found out from our first assignment. So it's definitely harder than it looks, and but you learn a ton, and it definitely makes the drawing feel better when you're more invested in it from the get-go. But I will post a bunch of references for you to choose from and spend some time, you know, which one you would respond to, and kind of get more into and see some of these connections is probably a good one to go with, and then spend even more time looking at it. And let's go ahead and flip it now and do the other side, just to kind of see again, just like the other lectures that we're posting here online, I don't usually get to spend as long doing these lectures in class. This is usually around this time I let you go draw, because I don't want to eat up all your drawing time. But since we don't get to work together, and I won't be able to talk with you about your own stuff until I see it in person, I'll go a little bit. I'm going to keep talking here, so hopefully you guys are enjoying this. So yeah, so this is interesting. Wow, it really is pushing that. The cupcake's still the first, but now we kind of get, I don't know. No, we could then get pulled over here second, even though this is further away from the light source. This, all the darks around it got drastically darker. So now the whole, what is light up there, previously it was just this little spot of light, right? And then that dark hole. Now it's the whole thing. So visually it got larger. The contrast area got larger. So it still has that strong weight to it because of the darks that are around it. And the picture definitely is more prominent as well. So we're still going first, second, third. But the boot is less active, right? So it's no longer really that gestural. All we're really seeing is just that it's an L shape. We're kind of missing this whole rhythm that rolls through. It's not quite as strong. So because of that, I feel like my eye just kind of goes back and forth in a line along here. So it's just a little bit more static. And now this is just more straight up and down. The arc of the handle isn't engaging the shadow that then caught the edge of this that brought us into it. I mean, that's still there, but not as nice as it was when the shadow was playing on it. The light side, dark side of that shadow. So I'd still say that the other way felt a little bit better. But obviously I set it up, so I'm partial to the way I chose. But you can see that there's definitely an effect visually how it changes. There's some cool stuff happening up there though. And I do like how that shadow continues through back there, so that's kind of a nice long connection, how it kind of connects into this. Pulls us, there's just a nice long line that feels like it's rolling through all of that brings us back up into the picture. Yeah, and then having that cast shadow on that boot now that brings us into that reflective light that just we can't go anywhere from there really. I mean, we can zig down if we want, but it'd be nice if we could get over here. You see there's a lot of dead space that's not active anymore. Cool. So then let's also throw up a little bit of a white background just so you can see. So what happens to it. You're welcome to set up still lifes with light backgrounds. I tend to do the darker backgrounds in this class because it allows for soft edges and for things to get lost, and it's a little bit easier to build form that way in space. But you can definitely do light backgrounds. I've had some students that think that it always has to be a dark background, and they'll bring in a drawing that's all dark background but the wall behind their objects is light, and they just thought that that was what they were supposed to do. Just draw what's in front of you, and if you go with a light background, and even if it's a white wall, bright white wall in the background painted with a bright white, squint and look. I mean, even in it's a little bit darker in the screen that you guys are seeing, but this is a bright white sheet. But when we squint, if we stare just at that white, it feels white. We don't want to go with our idea of what we know white is and just leave the paper white or just a little bit of a smudge of charcoal on it. We want to squint and see that these are all still quite a bit whiter than this cloth back here. So this is a pretty dark mid-tone back here. So, but what this does is it definitely activates that boot more. The boot's not a focal point though still. Its shape's pretty strong, so my eye goes to it, but it quickly then moves down to these focal points here. But my eye does go to that boot, and it's kind of nice to go to the boot, big shape boot, and then right to this cupcake. But now my eye, because of they're all kind of important now in a weird way, I'm kind of jumping around a lot. I don't really roll through it rhythmically as much. There's no slow points. Everything feels kind of fast. Where before it was nice to have that boot kind of feel a little slower, or just opposite of the others. So it kind of just makes it all based on the gestural rhythms as opposed to the value hierarchy. But it is kind of nice to see them all glowing as well. It's got a definitely different feel to it. Let's just see what it looks like one more time. Hopefully this is interesting. I love it, looking at this stuff. So, and this one here, sorry, you know, same things that are happening from the other side. Same downsides, I think. Not much gain. If anything, it's a loss because of this handle is, you know, before this was getting hit with quite a bit of light, and it was darker in this corner because the light was shining more over here. And so that handle still played a pretty nice role. But now it's kind of almost the same value as that background when you squint. So it's almost like from here over is of no, very little play in it, and makes it feel unbalanced onto this side now. So, but yeah, that's all based on just changing up your lights and playing with the background. You can imagine if the cloth down here was light, that would change things too. So play with what your objects are on, where you set them up. Most of the ones that I'll put online for you are going to be more in the dark zone, which helps, like I said, to build form. So you choose. I'm going to just adjust this a little bit up and over. All right. So that's kind of the basic rundown of choosing your focal points, things to think about. So hopefully this is making sense, and you know, so we're still going to be a little theoretical, but talking just a little bit more about why we're doing it and how to control it on the page a little bit. So in doing that, I always like to kind of bring up two words that I'll use when I give you feedback, and just to kind of help keep things separate, even though the two words are going to be detail and information, even though both of them sound somewhat similar. The concept is different between the two. So the first one would be information. So information is essentially documenting the value shifts that we see in all of the objects in the environment, documenting those value shifts from the plane's changing direction, either strong value shifts initially at the higher focal points, and then lessening in value contrast between those plane changes and the object as we move further down the focal point chain. And typically, you know, just like I said, most often the two main things that are going to affect how much information something has, contrast-wise, in that information, contrast-wise, is going to be based on the local value of the object and its proximity to the light source. Those are going to be the two biggest factors. And then within that is detail. So detail is essentially when we're adding detail to a drawing, we really are just increasing its sharpness in an area by increasing the contrast of the values in that area, increasing the contrast of the plane changes, between the plane changes in that area. So with that in mind, you know, you can do, just because this is the fourth focal point, it doesn't mean that we won't, we'll keep it loose and sloppy and undefined and not show the form that's there, not have all of the 5 values of, you know, the highlights, the midtones, the form shadow, the terminator, the reflective light, and the cast shadows, all of those things will be there. They will just be less in contrast than this, and then that information in this will be less in contrast than this one, and then this will be less in contrast than this one. So we're reserving the higher contrast in with respect to the hierarchy of focal points, as well as the information aspects in respect to as we move down the focal point chain. So your whole drawing should have, when doing realism, should have that a great level of information everywhere, but just controlling the detail for detail relationships. That's really good to keep in mind at the forefront of your mind when you're working in an area. Like, you're going to be tempted to push the juicy reflective aspects in this boot, and tempted to push the lights on these brighter than they are. When we squint, the highlights on that boot get quite a bit darker than all of the lights on these. But when we just stare at that reflective light that's bouncing off that boot, it feels so juicy and intense because of the dark around it. So to get that light to glow like that, you have to push that dark around the boot, around the reflective light on that boot, to make it feel bright and juicy. That will keep your hierarchy of focal points in check. Keep your value relativity in check as you do the drawing. So that's essentially what the detail versus information aspect comes into play. So keep that in mind, value relativity. The reason that we do this, if you keep these principles in mind, the reason that it's successful is because it really helps to create a convincing feeling of shared space and depth. So, by keeping your hierarchy of focal points working together, it makes it feel like they're all in the same environment together, that they're all a certain distance, an exact distance from the light source, from one another, with a particular texture and a particular local value. I talked about, when people forget to, when an artist you see that drawing where it has a bunch of information, but the detail's off. Like everything feels super shiny, like it has the value scale. Every object is a value scale of 1 through 9, as opposed to thinking about the local value and the light source. So it doesn't feel like they're in the same space together. It feels like each one is its own thing, but they're all by each other, and everything kind of feels like a shiny pop can. That's because they're not thinking about the hierarchy of focal points at the forefront of their mind. They have the information part down, but not controlling the relationships of them. So you can get a good sense of shared space that way, and depth. And then related to what we talked about in the basic value principles video is the notion that high contrast will pull forward and minimal contrast recedes in space. So you can see the high contrast here and the high contrast here, especially here. One, because there's a perspective that's happening, so it feels very spatial, but there's a high contrast here that's pulling this vase, part of the vase, in front of that back part of the vase where there's minimal contrast. If that highlight was too bright, or the shadow wasn't dark enough and we got too light on the light side of this would not feel behind this. And this boot wouldn't feel like it's leaning back in space if this was too light up here anywhere. It would start to feel like it's sitting upright, even though its contour is saying otherwise. Playing with that notion of high contrast pulling forward and minimal contrast receding in space creates a really great sense of depth. And by focusing on those hierarchy of focal points allows that great depth to remain intact. The other reason that the hierarchy of focal points works well to create the sense of realism is because looking at or creating a drawing that way is closer to how the human eye sees naturally. So you can do a little experiment here. You know, our eyes are not like a camera. So when a camera takes a picture, everything, unless you're a skilled photographer, which I'm not, everything is kind of all at the same level of contrast. Its edges and its sharpness, it all feels in focus at the same time. And the human eye does not work that way. So you can do a little experiment. So you're going to want to put your, to start off, your fingers out like this. So you're going to put your fingers up, pointing to the sky like that, and you're going to put both hands out, okay? And then about, you know, chest width apart, like the natural distance that they hang, or that they're out from one another. And then I want you to, you can put them a little bit closer actually, put them a little bit closer, and then I want you to just stare at one of your fingers, and you know, at the fingernail, and notice that the contrast, the detail becomes sharp on that finger. And even though the other finger, so I'm staring at my right, so my left finger, even though it's about the equal distance away from my eyes, and pretty close in proximity distance-wise from the right finger I'm staring at, it becomes out of focus, and its contrast becomes very minimal relative to the one that I'm staring at. Now I'm going to go ahead and now pull the left finger, so the finger I was not looking at, I'm going to pull it forward, and I'm going to just stare at the left finger now as opposed to the right one. So the right one's way out in front of me, the left one's closer to my eyes, and now everything around it and the other finger is less in contrast, and the one that I'm staring at is in greater contrast. So that creates a greater sense of depth. So when we draw this way, by crispening that contrast and then creating a focal point chain to move down, we create that sense of depth. We control the viewer's eye where they should be looking based on that, and make it the drawing feel more natural to the way we see, more realistic. So that's one of the other principles that allows the hierarchy of focal points to help create that sense of space and depth and realism. And related to that, sorry, I was distracted for a second. Related to that is going to be, you know, I guess the challenge with the hierarchy of focal points is exactly what I was talking about with the detail and the information, is as you try to push your drawing further and add more information and push the detail, the contrast where it's needed, the challenge with that is to not lose the overall larger relationships as you push the drawing further. So as you add more detail, like down in this dark space down here, or add detail like we're talking about on the boot in here, that as you do that, you don't lose the relationship of the boot to the picture and the boot to the vase, and the vase's light to the frosting, and the dark side of the frosting to the light side, and the dark side of the frosting to the picture, and the pictures, you know, so you don't lose those things as you add more information. And that's the challenge of, I think, drawing and pushing something further with detail, is keeping those relationships intact as you add more information in. So it's a fun game. And the other really helpful thing, which I usually say when you're in class, when we start getting into value and doing longer drawings, is make sure you step back from your drawing frequently to check those values. Up close, it might feel like you're keeping them intact, but when you step back, you'll see very clearly if you've blown something out. In particular, you know, the reflective light. So when you did your spheres and your bottle drawings, I'm sure some of you probably realized you were pushing that reflective light. Make sure you check it. That's one that tends to get blown out, is reflective light, and then also highlights. And when we blow those out, then they affect the values around it. So keep an eye on those. And I'm going to be doing a detail demo later on this week that I'll send to you, which will talk about how to achieve that more on the paper. And And I guess I'd say if you are diligent about, the hierarchy of focal points is great. I do really, it does help keeping it in mind. But if you're being diligent about checking your values against one another every time you work an area, you're working the light side of this, keep checking it against the other lights. Or if you're going to start an area you haven't worked very far yet, as you do, keep comparing, and that will really help. So if you're being truthful and paying close attention to the value relativity, then the hierarchy of focal points just kind of naturally happens. But I do think it's helpful to keep in mind, especially when you're setting up your still life, because it will help you make decisions about how to set it up. And it also is really helpful from the very beginning when you're making choices that will help guide your mark making process and how you build the form. If you aren't keeping it in mind at the beginning, you could push things too far one way or the other and then have to spend a lot of time correcting, or not push something dark enough right off the bat and then spend a lot of time on the light side, and then realize 3 hours later that, I should have gone darker on that side of the picture, and this got too light because of it, so now you're reworking this whole thing, and then you probably have other areas that were dependent upon when you did check a couple times down the road. So keeping it in mind from the very beginning is super helpful. And yeah, that's it for now on the hierarchy of focal points. Hopefully that was helpful. I think this is a fairly long lecture, but it's a really important principle, and we spend a lot of time going over it one-on-one in class, so I just really wanted to make sure to drive it home. Hopefully you enjoyed it and can put it to good use in your work. A recommendation that I have is to listen to this video, start your longer term drawing, and then about halfway through, watch it again. I know it's a little bit of extra time, but we're not seeing each other, so we all have a little bit more of that one way or the other if you have that time. I know it's a hard time for everybody, but if you have that time, it would be very helpful. Put your drawing up across the room and watch the video and look at it. Look at your drawing while you listen, or even just have it on in the background while you're drawing for a little bit. Like we're in the classroom and I'm talking while you're working. So, but I hope you guys are all well. Hope you're enjoying the videos, and if you have questions, definitely shoot them to me on the Monday feedbacks emails, and if questions come up, I can, if a bunch of them come up in one area, I can talk about them, briefly answer them in some of the upcoming demos too. So, but yeah, hope you're all well, and I'll see you on the next video.